Good morning, everyone. My name is Heather Exner-Pro. I'm coming to you from just outside Calgary on the Tsuut'ina Nation, and delighted to be hosting this MLI Macdonald-Laurier Institute webinar on the climate crisis, energy crisis, and security crisis, global energy politics, and Canada's role. And I think, with COP26 behind us, some energy crisis in Europe, attention has definitely focused to some of the new dynamics that maybe we haven't had to confront yet. The only thing worse than a climate crisis is probably having a climate crisis, an energy crisis, and a security crisis concurrently. And so what can Canada do to help mediate this, adapt to this, change this? So I'm delighted to have with us some excellent guests today, really the experts on this situation, to talk us through this. We're going to start with the first hour with the domestic panel with Tim McMillan, President and CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, Rafi Tamazian, Senior Portfolio Manager at Canoe Financial. And Rafi, if I'm correct, one of the last energy funds still standing in Canada, now reaping the rewards. And also Chris Sankey, a Senior Fellow at Macdonald-Laurier Institute and an Indigenous business leader in the oil and gas industry. After this hour, we'll switch over to a global panel. But first, so hang on to your seats. We have 2 full hours to talk about this, but we'll start with this session first. So you guys are all experts on the Canadian oil and gas industry. It's, a lot has been happening in the last decade, in the last year, and now in the last week, really. Things keep happening in the situation. So why don't you guys start me off, about 5 minutes each, and just tell me kind of what are your thoughts on the situation, the Canadian oil and gas industry, how this relates to the global climate crisis, how we're seeing, what Canada's role is in the energy crisis and helping to adapt to that, and where you see this heading. Tim, I'm going to start with you.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Heather, for the introduction, and to Macdonald-Laurier for hosting this discussion. I think it is extremely topical, and some of the decisions we've made in the last few years are coming home to roost as a nation and globally. And the decisions that'll be made to address those 3 crises as you identify will have a long-term effects on us as Canadians and broader as well. As you note, I represent the upstream oil and gas industry in Canada. We are in a very blessed place that we have world-class resources. We have over 400 years of supply of natural gas. We have the world's 3rd largest supplies of crude oil. And we produce both of them in a way that are exceptional, that we have the lowest or as low as anywhere in the world GHG natural gas in how we produce it in the types of formations. We are close to large markets if we can get the infrastructure in place to get it there. On the crude oil side, again, we have a diversity of assets from offshore Newfoundland right across to shale oils in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin and oil sands. And we have the capacity to innovate, drive down emissions. The oil sands have lowered emissions on their production by 20% in the last decade, and the technologies they're bringing forward will further lower it by another 10 to 15% in the next decade. And that is not consistent with the rest of the world. When you look at the other top 10 energy producers, they don't have the capacity to invest in technology and innovation like we do. And it's not a core driver. It's not a principle like in Canada, continuous improvement across all our operations, be it health, safety, efficiency. That's just how we operate. So I thought I'd do a bit of a look at some of the challenge that we're currently facing, that we have been putting in energy policies in Canada, consistent with several around the world, certainly in developed nations, that I think have led us to this place of energy crisis, climate crisis, and security crisis. And I think we could bundle all 3 up under a political crisis, that the challenges we're facing all come back to that one common point. But, just a couple of the places this is really playing out right now is in China, that the political crisis has led to blackouts across much of the country. Industrial capacity has dropped off. Citizens have been told you may not have reliable power or power at all through most of the next months through winter. And that is due to increasing demands as they continue to develop and offer better living standards to their population, that people are heating their homes for the first time, and that takes energy. It also comes from a political basis that they had got into a fight politically with Australia and stopped taking imports of coal. They then further put out some statements about not pursuing coal into the future, but within weeks they had to reverse themselves and ramp up their own coal production. China last month was producing a record amount of coal again, something that I think is counterproductive to some of the intent that got them into the problem. And it's easy to say, well, a developing nation, third world, second world nations are going to struggle with energy security. But ironically, we're seeing this in Europe right now. England is got very low levels of storage. They've shut off their nuclear or shutting it off. They've shut off their coal. It's also the case in most of Europe that they've gone away from nuclear. Again, ironic given some of the challenges that we're facing on the climate side. But they put themselves behind the 8 ball. And if we have a cold winter, the effects could be devastating on people that thought for a generation that the capacity to turn on the heat when you need it was just a given. It may not be. If we look a little closer to home, the United States also has put policies in place that seem counterproductive across these 3 challenges. They canceled a pipeline from Canada, their largest trading partner, their largest energy supplier. They took every opportunity to virtue signal that this was to put them on a new path. But within months, the president is appealing to OPEC, appealing to Russia to turn on the taps. And just yesterday, we saw that they've opened their strategic reserve and they have reached out to nations around the world. That the second the politics gets a little bit challenging, and the politics because the price of energy goes up, which is the intent of their energy policies to start with, it leads us in a complete circle, and the people left holding the bag are the citizens of the country. And I think that there's a far better path forward. Maybe just a couple final thoughts here about Canada, is we're not immune to some of the political drivers that are limiting our capacity economically and putting us at risk. Both, we think it's ironic that we have 300 years supply, but some of the energy policies we're putting in place are driving costs above where some Canadians feel comfortable paying, and that we have limited our ability to meet the needs of our customers. We canceled pipelines, Northern Gateway, Energy East. At one point, we had 16 LNG facilities that could be supplying China with more natural gas today so that they aren't producing record amounts of coal. We didn't allow them to move through the regulatory process in a way that got them under construction and built. For Europe, we just had Quebec cancel a major LNG facility. Again, that could have been a clear connection of high quality Canadian gas. So, I'm going to conclude my comments there, but these problems we're currently facing are of a political making. And they all come back together with Canada can and should be a major producer, supplier of choice, and solution on both climate and energy security. And at this point, our hands are somewhat tied, limiting our ability to be that supplier of choice. So thanks for the opportunity. Look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Tim. And I know you've been at CAP. Is it 7 years now? What a roller coaster of a ride it must have been. And I know you're heading out next year. So there must be some satisfaction in Calgary in the oil and gas industry with, prices coming back and people starting to appreciate the need for oil and gas. But a bit of a, also it's bad for the world, so not something that I think the oil and gas industry wanted to see. Would much prefer just reliable and market-oriented policies. And so for that market-oriented policies, I'm going to turn to Rafi Tamazian, who is, one of the last leading energy fund directors in Canada and knows all about the energy market and has been on a roller coaster, I'm sure, himself. But now you've voted it out, Rafi. Here you are at the end of it. Things are looking good for your sector, but of course, things aren't looking great, maybe for a number of competing global crises. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, Tim made a lot of great points there, and I could go down several of those rabbit holes, and I'm going to try to pick a couple of them. I think the first thing that I want to just augment Tim's comment with is how he finished his conversation. And I would add to that I think it's time that maybe one of the mistakes we're making is we're judging all barrels the same. We look at the world's 100 million barrels and we judge them all in the same light. And the world is using oil at an accelerated pace. The demand is there, it's insatiable. The demand for energy is actually growing faster than it ever has in the history of using energy that we record. And we're using oil to do it. And so by not producing Canadian oil, if we grade our oil both on its environmental standards and then you would grade our country on a human rights track record, you'll find we're the safest barrel of oil that needs to be produced in the world. And instead we're retracting ours, which gives other people a chance to produce oil that have lower standards on all those levels. That's bad. So I want people to recognize that. But the one thing I'm going to maybe bring up here is I'm going to take this up a notch because Canada is a low declining asset base and we're not a high cost producer. We actually want to see OPEC in control. Why do we want OPEC in control? The thing I want listeners to understand is that OPEC is not someone you should villainize. OPEC is actually absolutely interested in a very high price of oil. They want to profit from their product, but they don't want to kill the goose. So they want the price to be as high as it can be that keeps the economy operating very well, a good operating economy. They don't want to raise the price so that it kills the economy. They also want to keep it stable. And this is the important factor that everyone has to understand. Stabilizing the oil price gives a producer the ability to start to predict a lot more comfortably these massive capital expenditures that are required just to maintain production, let alone grow it. So all of this demand that we all keep burgeoning out, we're going to need supply for it. And if we don't have that supply, we're going to have situations where panic sets in. And this panic is not just expensive costs, it's actually not having the product available to you. And that's going to, in some countries, that'll create civil war and death and carnage. So stability by OPEC is critical so that producers can start to make meaningful decisions on massive capital programs to try to maintain this exceptionally capital intensive asset base. And what are we doing this for? I mean, we could be doing it for ultimately creating time for these alternative energy strategies. But I would tell you at this point, those alternative energy strategies are still experiments. And so we are not trying to stabilize oil prices and stabilize the production so that we can get onto these alternatives. I would say today we have put these alternatives into a situation where they normally would be invested in by speculative private equity that would rise and fall based on their success or failure. Instead, we have governments putting money into these things with our money and in like enormous amounts of capital. And the only other parties that they're really putting money into it are excessively rich individuals who are being kind of guilted into putting money into these things. And these experiments, we don't even know if they're going to fail or not. So we are running down this path to this alternative energy strategy, for now has proved to be variable at best and very expensive. And we are ignoring the traditional use. But the last thing I'm going to leave people with is take what I've just said in all this, all the expensive nature of all these alternatives that we get to, the luxury that we get to have in the developed world. We have energy in our backyard, accessible. We have money to spend frivolously on these alternative energy experiments. What about the developing world? That's where the majority of the population exists. And there's a billion people that don't even have electricity yet. There are several billion that don't have the kind of healthcare remotely that we talk about. And none of that stuff has been able to be demonstrated with these alternative energy sources. You can't build it out without that. And that developing world is going to want what we have. We can't have two standards in the world. We're going to move 1 billion people out of poverty in the next 15 years. Another way of saying that is we're going to move 1 billion people into being addicted to energy. And we haven't accounted for those people yet. I'm going to leave it there, Heather. There was a lot to think about, and look forward to Chris's comments.
Thanks so much, Rafi. I think from an economist perspective, we've been coming at this at the supply side and doing nothing on the demand side, and that's kind of a recipe for disaster. So thanks for your comments. And then I'll turn over to you, Chris, and then we'll get to the discussion. But Chris, you're looking at this, and Rafi talked about not every barrel is the same as a barrel, and the human rights and the social responsibility, and then also, the environmental side. And I know you're involved in LNG on the Northwest Coast with a lot of Indigenous projects. Also, people appreciate the extent to which Indigenous communities are involved in natural gas and LNG and oil and gas projects in the West, and especially on the West Coast. So what's your perspective on all this? What do you want to see happen?
Well, thank you. Thank you for putting on the webinar, Heather, much appreciated. Forever and a day, Indigenous people have always wanted to be a part of this economy. And now is our time to shine, if I will. And to watch what's happening is actually extremely frustrating, because it's the first time in Canadian history that Indigenous people have had a chance to be at the table, to have a seat and a say in ownership. And to watch what's happening is mind-blowing. Rafi explained it best. It reminded me of when I first started playing basketball. My coach said I had tunnel vision. I was 10 years old, and I kept focusing on one spot. And what I was missing was the opportunity to pass the ball to my teammates. And that's what's happening with Canada. We are so focused on this renewable aspect of trying to change our economy with these experiments that have yet to be proven. We're missing the opportunity to work together right across this province. It's important that we start working together. Right now in our communities, forever and a day, we've always had to pick between paying hydro or food. And to see that we're trying to get away from energy is just absurd. I know many people that are struggling right now and making that decision and having to budget just to pay the rent, just to pay the mortgage, to go buy food and get to and from our communities. The community I'm from, you got to drive on and take a ferry. It takes energy. You got to heat your homes. You got to do all those things. And I think Indigenous people today are starting to realize the impacts they could have on today's economy and when they're at the table. And I think the biggest thing that's missing here is that a lot of our voices, the pro-responsible resource development voices, are not being heard. And there are more Indigenous people in favor of responsible resource development than there is at any time in the history of Canada than today. And so to think that, or to say that we are not in favor of oil and gas is actually a misstatement. It is false. It is not true. Our people are fully engaged in terms of wanting responsible resource development. They just want to be able to make it on their terms. So when you combine traditional knowledge with today's innovation and technology and expertise that we see here today on this panel, we could make for an amazing project. Now, for years, for about 15, 20 years, everyone thought common sense was going to prevail, including myself. And I admit the fact that I actually was misled to believe that this energy sector was going to hurt and harm our way of life. That's not true. I have experienced firsthand with P&W when they were going to come to our community. The benefits we were taking in were incredible, and that was just pre-FID. From the jobs from environmental monitoring, engineering, construction, management. You name it, it was all coming, and our benefits package was incredible. It was up to $2.4 billion in benefits, $1 billion direct award, fair market value bids. It was incredible, and our communities were at the time not prepared. But I think this time around, and based on my conversations with some incredible leaders, I think our people are starting to realize, first, what we missed, and two, starting to understand what actually LNG and oil are all about. But in the beginning, I think what had happened was that our people just weren't ready for this particular industry. Not so much because they were against the industries, because they didn't understand it. As I said to my comments earlier, is I really believe that our people need to engage in energy literature. I think individuals need to understand this isn't just about heating your homes or driving your cars or getting into a plane. Everything that we consume today requires petroleum-produced products. And from wind farms to solar, and you know as well, Heather, a presentation we had just witnessed a couple of weeks ago, by 2040, the world is going to have to invest roughly about $20 trillion in the oil and gas sector in order to meet demand. Even with the increase of wind farm and the increase in solar, the demand relatively stays the same, and it's only going to get worse. It's only going to go up if we don't start doing something about it. Add the fact that by 2050, there'll be another billion people on the planet. As per Rafi's comments, that people don't understand. This isn't just about trying to kill an industry. What they don't understand is that with that another billion people coming, in terms of the energy each of us use, called British thermal units, each one of us give off about 1,000 BTUs per person per day on the planet. So you can't be blaming all of this energy crisis, or sorry, the climate crisis on the energy sector. The energy sector is 10 years ahead. When you take a look, I mean, I don't even have to explain it. Like, you know what we're doing in the energy sector. I mean, the wealth of knowledge that I think our people need to be able to get access to, it will help them understand to make a better informed decision. And so with that being said, at the end of the day, it's important that our people get a chance to sit at the table. It's important that our people get a chance to have a say. It's important for our people to have to put forward the traditional knowledge of the territories to which the projects would be proposed at. And at the end of the day, together we're stronger. I really believe that with the expertise of industry at the table, the financial capabilities, which, by the way, Indigenous people lack of, because first of all, we don't own the land. We don't own fee simple land. And in fact, what most of our communities are doing now is they're actually buying back fee simple land, the highest land value, as you know. And so as an Indigenous person sitting back and being a former elected official for our community, we can't make a decision on crucial infrastructure without Ottawa telling us so. And by the way, in that, what people don't understand, by the time that $1 gets back to our community, it's about 10 cents on the dollar by the time it goes through the administration bureaucracy of the process. And it's just not enough. We have roughly about 650 communities in this country, and we have a budget of about between 7 and 8 billion. Newfoundland alone has the same budget. So it's just not self-sufficient. We want to be a sovereign nation. We want to start managing wealth and getting away from poverty, so that I hope in my lifetime, we could start passing on intergenerational wealth to the next generation.
Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks to all of you guys. That's a great start. I know there's going to be people in this audience, you know, who are wondering about the climate crisis, though, that I think a rational person can see that there's an energy crisis and that's important and we need to address it. And we're not doing a very good job of addressing that. And we're all starting to feel that pain. But at the same time, there is a climate crisis. And Tim, I know you just came from COP26. Some people, I think, you know, in a fantasy world, think that we should just not have any more big oil, not have any more pipelines, not have any more oil and gas infrastructure. And I'd like to see that all disappear, you know, by 2025, by 2030. In some ways, it seems crazy that if we're in an energy transition, you want to get rid of the experts in energy, in the financing, the production, the transmission of it. But I know, Tim, that you guys are thinking about it, and you do have pressure from shareholders to think about it. What is your role if we need oil and gas, we need an energy industry, and we have a climate crisis? You know, what are you guys seeing at COP26? What are you guys doing to get to net zero? What is the role of the energy industry in this?
Yeah, great question. And I've been to a few COPs now, and I can say this one was like the others in that, you know, there's some big ideas, there's a lot of talk, but no one, even at the climate conference, is talking about lower standards of living. Like, no one. There are people that are talking about raising standards of living, and then you get to the how do you move forward and meet the objectives both environmentally and for the growing demand. There's really two schools of camps, two ideologies. One is you set the target of net zero. Anything that is not immediately lowering emissions is not up for discussion, and that camp is extremely well represented at those COP meetings, where no more coal, no more oil and gas. They need to be phased out. That no more exploration should even take place. Then there's the other camp that, and I guess maybe I finish off the first camp. It's only technologies that are going to dramatically decrease CCUS, bringing on hydrogen, wind, solar. Only those things are up for consideration. The other camp is, we see today record amounts of coal coming back online, and that there is an immediate imperative to lower emissions. And the largest emissions in Canada, in the US, in Europe, emission reductions has come from phasing out coal and replacing it with natural gas. By far, the biggest reductions. I think that is still the biggest opportunity we have with phasing out coal in Asia, in China, in India. We did the math of just the new-fired coal-fired power plants under development and construction today. If those were stopped and just natural gas was put in their place, the reduction in GHGs would be more than all of Canada's emissions combined, our entire country. But that it requires infrastructure. It requires Canada being a larger supplier that is displacing lower quality oils and gases from around the world. And at the end of the day, those are two very different views on a common future of responsible development. And I would say the Canadian energy sector is crucial to both. We are today lowering our emissions on every barrel we produce. We are producing more responsible gas that should be connected to those coal-fired power plants. We are also investing in CCUS and hydrogen in ways that no other industry or government is on the, if you need the big wins. So really, we're up for both sides of it, and it is counterproductive to say that oil and gas shouldn't be at the center of finding some of these solutions, because we're already there.
Thanks, Tim. Rafi, from your perspective, what is the role of investors in helping further this transition? What is the rational economic actor approach, I guess, in facilitating some of this? There we go.
How I chose to approach it early on this year. I actually have a lot of dialogue with the producers, because I'm from the oil patch myself, and so I'll tell you, like last night I was curling with my three partners. All three run oil and gas companies, and last year when we were curling, I was saying to them, "Hey, listen, you've got your investors involved here. We've stuck it out for 6 years. We've tried to explain to the world that you can't attack the production if you don't attack the consumption," which is what Tim was talking about. You're eventually going to run into a cross of your supply and demand, and you're going to have a real problem on your hands. And we're in that problem today. Now, what I don't want is a bunch of producers trying to do stupid things to bribe investors to invest in them. And what we've gotten instead was they listened. They listened to the investor, and the investor said, "We don't want you to grow anymore." The free world of oil and gas, which is not colluding like OPEC, they act independently. The investors independently told them, "If you try to grow, we'll crucify you." So they shrunk their size of their businesses from a people perspective, and they turned into financial manufacturing businesses. They've consolidated. We have 34% of the gas market in Canada was represented by the 5 biggest producers a year ago. Today it's 48%. They're consolidating into less entities. They're getting bigger, reducing their costs. They're producing the widget cheaper, and they're pumping out cash to the market. They've become distributors, regular and variable. So what is it going to take to get them to produce? Is it asking them to produce? No. Is it even convincing them because the price is higher? Well, how much higher does the price need to go? Because what you have right now, and this is not me talking, this is the producers. They're like, well, you want me to grow, that means I have to, expand my human resources department. Then I got to expand and manage a bunch of more people. I have to create a capital program that has risk. Right now, I have no risk. Cash is just coming back to me. But I'm going to create a capital program that carries risk for the future. And I'm going to have to procure assets to drill all of this. And the service sector is obliterated. So there's going to be a lot of risk that the services aren't even going to be there. And if they are, they're going to raise their rates. So my returns are going to be variable. And I'm going to have to deal with the vagaries of the market. Some will be angry that I'm growing. Some will be happy that I'm growing. And then I'm going to have to drill, complete, test, bring online this production, only to fall off a cliff at the end. Or I can continue to keep my feet up here and keep pouring money into my pocket. It is going to take a lot of convincing for these producers to produce. Now, the last thing I'll say is, how are we going to move this product? What's going to take to get it across? This pipeline debate is completely ridiculous to me. It gave me the comfort that this was a movement that really was not using a lot of intelligence behind it. I fashioned the pipeline and transportation of those molecules similar to transporting people when we travel. The safest form of transportation is airlines. But when a plane crashes, everybody gets worried when they get in a plane. But the safest form of transportation on this planet has always been, for the last several decades, airlines. It's about the amount of air travel that there is. There's so much of it. But one plane goes down, everybody panics. It's the same thing for pipelines. The safest form of transportation of these hydrocarbons is through pipelines, not with trucks. We're celebrating that we're moving off of pipes so that we can move it by rail and truck. This tells me that we are completely off track. And the realities are we have to gravitate back towards the realities that we are addicted to oil, per both Chris and Tim's comments, and that the forms of transportation, the traditional forms that we've had in the past, are the safest forms. And until we figure out these alternative experiments that we are working with, these are the forms that we have to gravitate back to continue to operate and let the economy grow. Otherwise, we're going to find that the economy is going to get truncated.
Thanks so much, Rafi. And that's a great segue to Chris, because you're on the BC Northwest Coast, and the big topic in the news this week is there's more blockades on the CGL pipeline and more variability, as Rafi might put it, on LNG in Canada. Can you give us your perspective, Chris? Because I think the mainstream media doesn't always do a justice of representing what maybe the majority of Indigenous people in your corner of the world think about LNG and the work and the discussions and the debates and the referendums that your communities have put into this issue in the last 10 years.
Yeah, look, it's extremely frustrating. Before I make a comment to that, earlier we were talking about disarray in countries if energy starts to disappear. Well, look what's happening in Haiti. I mean, it's being run by gangs. It's being run by people that have no respect for the law. But then we talk about equality of life. Let's take a look right here in Canada. I mean, look what's happening in our Indigenous communities. I mean, it's no secret that there's a water issue. There's no secret that there's not enough infrastructure into our communities. It's no secret that we lack affordable health care. All of this takes money. And if you don't have the capital and the wherewithal to do all that, then we're going to continue to stay where we're at, managing poverty instead of wealth. But that said, look, at the end of the day, I think as a nation, we have failed the opportunity to really pay close attention to these interest groups that have come into Canada. I think that we need to start doing something about this, because a lot of these camps that have been set up, and with all due respect, I know a lot of these people in these nations, from the Wet'suwet'en down to the Pachida in our own territories and just right across the country. It's the same groups of people tied into the same groups of non-government organizations who continue to take in foreign funds to come in and block Canada's resource development opportunities. And in a process, they actually think they're helping us. They're not. what they're actually doing is keeping our people in poverty. We talk about how we want to get out of poverty, yet the very people that claim to say they're there to help us, the very people that claim to say they're there for to bring our voice to the global stage are the same people stifling our opportunities to be a part of this economic engine. And in this economic engine is energy. And at the end of the day, I just have to step back and think, what are we doing? You know, I always go back to the comments in my discussions with some incredible business people. You know, the comments of, one, we've lost the art of critical thinking. Two, we got to get back to common sense. Nobody that I know in all of my travels and anywhere I've gone, whether you're Indigenous or not, nobody wants to destroy the earth on half of development. I mean, it's absurd to think that we're going to keep going back to that same discussion when pipes are the safest way to transport this product in this country. And if we continue to allow interest groups to dictate our future, well, then our past becomes our future, and it's not going to change. And despite all these wonderful opportunities that they say that the green energy is going to bring, nothing in this country will bring the amount of benefits that the energy sector could bring to our communities to be a part of Canada instead of being apart from Canada. We need to start waking up, and we need to get our communities on board. And I think it's starting to happen in my discussions. There's still much work to happen. And more of our people are starting to ask amazing questions, and they're starting to understand what energy sector is all about and how it's going to help us get out of poverty.
Thanks so much, Chris. Our next session is really going to focus on the geopolitics, but I wanted to get some of your perspectives too, you guys, because there's so much going on. And we talked a little bit before the webinar about, you know, the SPR release, the Strategic Reserve release from the United States. You know, coming to this, you know, I just moved to Alberta 2 years ago, so I have gone a real 101 on energy politics, you know, and of course lots is happening. But now I'm coming to see how reliant Canada's energy sector has been on the United States. And that might have made sense before the shale revolution when it was a huge market. And now it's really hurting us that we aren't able to export at a higher price. And now we're really vulnerable to American policies and to, you know, like you said, a lot of this it's very political. So here, you know, from a climate perspective, you might want to increase the price of oil and gas. And in Canada, we've done that with a carbon tax. But the United States, you know, as soon as their, you know, gas tanks, you know, cost $50 to fill, then it's a crisis, and they're releasing their strategic reserve. So I'm wondering what you guys think. You know, what is a rational policy for Canada? Should we disengage kind of from our dependence on the American market, and what would that take? Tim, I'll start with you. You're me. There we go.
Yeah, I caught myself there. In Canada, I think that we have a couple of challenges, and if I had some criticism for our federal government, it would be that we confuse domestic policy with global realities. That in Canada, we can put in very strong incentives that drive up the price of natural gas and of gasoline and of diesel fuel, and put in border protection so that Canadians pay it, and it'll change incentives. People will drive less. They'll build smaller houses. We can do that. We also then have to decide what's our role globally. Do we want to displace oil coming out of Venezuela or gas coming out of Qatar because we think we do it better and the world would be a better place? But what I'm seeing is we are very often saying, because in Canada we have a carbon tax, we are mandating a electric vehicle fleet, that the oil demand is going to go down. And they're putting policies in place that would mirror or pair those two things up. Kind of bridging to your question about, you know, on that global question, if we do take the initiative to say we are going to be that supplier of choice, the U.S. is a great customer. They're one of the world's largest consumers. They have the largest refining capacity for heavies in the Gulf Coast. They will always be important to us. But when we're looking at where's the ball going to be next, it's Asia. And building the capacity to our West Coast for oil and gas is just crucial. The cancellation of Northern Gateway, I think, was a serious blow to Canada's future opportunities. And then putting Bill C-48 in that then said that there's a moratorium on any new project that would connect Canadian resources, non-persistent oils to the West Coast is extremely problematic, and I think insulting to some that are putting forward projects that would be very environmentally responsible. So we have done this to ourselves as a nation, and I think that the incentives that we're currently seeing out there economically should be forcing us to reconsider some of these policies, as well as the costs and the climate costs of not having Canadian products, because it's becoming increasingly obvious that it's a lower quality product, coal or oil and gas from other places that are just going to backfill what Canada doesn't.
And Rafi, I'll turn that over to you, because you must have cried a little bit a few times in the last few years, to see the price differential, because we are tied, to American refineries, I guess. And there was also an audience question about developing our own refinery capacity. So what are your thoughts, Rafi, on this dependence on the United States? What we should do to kind of get out of it, or what would make sense from an investor perspective?
Well, one thing we should preface here, and Tim may know this better than I do, but I know that in NAFTA, the previous agreement, there is actually we have an agreement that there is a minimum amount of oil we can't export oil to other countries other than the United States, to the tune of 80% of that production. That was NAFTA, and I don't know if it was rolled over into the new agreement. So there's an obligation that if we start sending oil to other countries and it amounts to, starts dipping into that 80%, the U.S. can theoretically come back and say, no, you have an obligation to deliver that to us, not to them. And so that's one thing that might be binding us that I've yet to look into that other agreement. It's only become more applicable now as security issues start to be raised, and the U.S. is talking about backing up their own exports and forcing businesses to not export oil for security reasons. You may see that enacted on that agreement, that North American agreement, but it doesn't apply to gas. And so we are a heavy oil producer and a gas producer. We're not a light oil producing country, and that's important for people to understand too. Gas, and by the way, we talk about all the alternatives replacing oil, and everybody focused on wind and solar, which are completely useless. And in fact, what has been happening is that the real alternative to oil turned out to be gas. And gas is growing aggressively. And Canada needs to be on the forefront of that more. We need to be building out infrastructure to provide this cleaner fuel, if you will, as a means to piggyback off of the time needed for these alternative strategies and experiments to be tested. And so I would argue that, and the build out is intensive capital and time, I would say the next alternative is going to be nuclear. But there is time constraints to that one, and because it takes so long to bring it on. And I think also it would be really mindful for people to stop trying to be in one camp or the other. I think you should think about your usage as in not I use oil energy or I use alternative energy, but I'm addicted to electrons. I consume electrons at a biblical rate. And we have gone into this situation, I think we've developed a situation of one or the other because of this movement that developed a decade ago where they said they wanted to try to kill fossil fuels. And you need an enemy to do that. And when you looked at your enemy and you said, well, let's go after the person using it. And they went, well, the problem is that's everybody. How can your enemy be everybody? We're going to lose. Okay, well, who's producing it? Well, it's oil companies. Oh, let's make the oil company the villain. And that's what's really developed over this decade. And now we are literally killing the industry that is feeding us. And we did not stop our appetite. We've created instead, and on top of that, COVID really moved everybody from being this, in the developed world, this selflessness, to suddenly selfish again. You know, we moved from going inner city, we're going out of the city now. And people are all driving their own cars. We're not car sharing. I mean, we don't hear about that anymore. Can you imagine sitting in a car with a stranger without a plexiglass between you and that person? And when you go to the mall, you don't go to the mall anymore. You and buy 8 items. You call and ask for those 8 items to be delivered to your house, and they're in a box and they're packaged nicely, each one. And then 4 of them don't fit, so you call them back and they come and get them and take it back so you can get the new ones. It's we've become egregious in our usage, and while we're attacking the provider. And I mean, just anybody with common sense, Chris mentioned it, common sense is required here. And that's what you need to ask your average human being, to think logically and think with common sense. That's what we're doing. And we're realizing that this product that we have in our backyard, we've talked ad nausea about its quality and the standards that we produce it with. It needs to be developed more aggressively, and it needs to compete with the global market more.
Thanks for that, Rafi. And, you know, I'm starting to hear a theme from you guys that natural gas, LNG, is probably the most pragmatic solution to the climate crisis, the energy crisis, and the security crisis that we're going to be confronted with in the next 2, 3, 4 decades. And Chris, I know that's your wheelhouse. That's what you guys have going on in your neck of the woods. Are we going to see more LNG projects? What's stopping it? Is C-48 going to be forever? What are you hearing on the ground out there?
Well, look, I think the only way any project's ever going to get built if it's Indigenous Light. That's just the fact. And that's the only way it's going to happen. On top of that, in order for that to happen, I think policy development as well as environmental assessment, the process it needs to be led, it needs to be developed, and it needs to be led by First Nation. That's the only way this is going to happen. When it comes to Bill C-48, the only way that is going to happen is if the Indigenous leaders themselves come forward with a solution to that very issue of Bill C-48. I know it's a hot topic. I know it's going to be a discussion at some point here in the future, but it has to come from them, and has to come from their communities. It has to be a discussion amongst each community themselves on what they want to do. And at the end of the day, they got to make a decision. But LNG is still on the table. There are a number of projects that are being proposed, and everyone on this panel knows that it is the alternative to reducing GHG emissions. It's just common sense. But if we don't start coming to the table and start working with Indigenous communities, which I believe industry is doing either anyway, we won't see another project. But what I do know is that Indigenous communities want to see responsible resource development on their terms. And the discussions I've had is that they need to be able to dictate where and how and when this is going to move forward. And I think it's indicative that we make sure that traditional knowledge is incorporated into this process. Forever and a day, our people felt left out of the national economy, the national energy, and the economic engine of this country. But what we need to get back to understanding is the fact that when we look at our highways, we look at our waterways and railways, all of those logistic hubs, all those corridors were developed by Indigenous people. So if we could get back to the basics and understanding that the very lands that these projects or infrastructures are proposed, it's the people that live there, and they need to be included in this process. To not only, one, be included, but two, that they're meaningfully engaged and that they have a say in their future, that they have a say what's being built in their backyard. At the end of the day, when the pipe goes into the ground, you need to engage the very people that pipe is going in the ground from. And if you don't do that, you're going to continue to have this. And so I've noticed, and this is just my unbiased opinion, that our people are now starting to talk about energy. Now, you're always going to get people that are going to be the naysayers. That's their given right. That's why there's a democratic process. But where I find things are kind of getting fuzzy and frustrating and confusing to Canadians is that there's this divide, or was perceived divide, that somehow the hereditary system is not agreeing with our elected body. That's not true. I know in our community that our elected body is not only funding the process, they're actually wanting to work with the hereditary system in order to make this work. So when you get the hereditary system on board, when you get the very people whose names belong to the territory, that's how this works. It's not the person, it's the name that is passed down. Like, for example, my name is passed down to me. That name holds title to the land. And whenever my time on this earth is up, the name is passed down to another person, and then that name is carried on and so forth. So when you get to incorporate that process with our governing body, and what happens is you not only get more support, you get to a very combined decision-making process. You create unity, and then you come in with one voice, and then you end up working together as one nation. And I think now what I'm finding is that there are more communities more inclined to work with our neighboring communities. And that's how we're going to get through this, is that we're sitting at the table and we look at common interest, political risk, and the path forward, and together solving the problem which is getting our product to new markets. And it doesn't just have to be energy, fish, forestry, goods and services. People forget there's these stores called Amazon, Canadian Tire, and Walmart. They're not going to stop producing petroleum-based products. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. It's just common sense. They're going to continue to produce this stuff. They're going to continue to use this, and this stuff is going to keep coming out every day, every second. And to Rafi's comments, every day, 5 people enter the middle class. And it's just going to keep going up. And as Indigenous people, we have an opportunity to provide the solution to get to new markets.
Okay. I think it was every second, Chris. Every second, 5 people.
Yeah, every second, yes.
But just very quickly, Tim and Rafi, before we kind of get onto policy, Chris said he doesn't see projects going ahead unless they're Indigenous led. And I don't think that's a revolutionary statement. I hear that in Calgary and in the energy sector and with investors too. So do you want to, what is the perspective of producers and investors? I think they want to see Indigenous led investment because de-risk projects. Is that right?
I think that one of the biggest changes we've seen in the last few years has been Indigenous business leaders, community leaders stepping up, like Chris. Yesterday, I was on a panel at the COAOC, the Oil Drillers and Contractors Association, and Stephen Buffalo was on that panel, and talking about kind of the strength of those communities, their desire to see these projects go forward, the importance of the energy sector and the partnerships in the self-determination. We've often said that we think oil and gas plays an important role in supporting the economic self-determination of Indigenous communities, probably more than any other industry, partly because where we're located, that where we produce and where the infrastructure to get those products to market. And I think that the point Chris raises is absolutely true. Where we have seen success, it has had Indigenous leadership, ownership, partnership, and maybe most importantly, we have seen an increase in Indigenous voices that are willing to step out and say, hey, I'm involved here. My company is doing the work here. My company owns part of this project. And it is very difficult for those foreign activists to drive a wedge when you get those strong, clear voices that are saying, no, that this is my project.
And Rafi, what are investors looking at when they're looking at whether it's a safe bet, whether it's risky, or are they just tired of it and not going to invest anymore?
I've worked in this business for 30 years, and I've come from the oil patch to the energy banking side to now the investment side, and I've never seen our industry like this, because we were exploration industry when I started. We were an exploitation industry through my banking world, and now we are a manufacturer, and we are a cash machine right now. And I ask you to find an industry anywhere in the world than what's happening in Canada in energy, where you have 25% free cash flow. It doesn't exist anywhere in any investment in the world. So by standards of best opportunities, I would say this is the best opportunity we've ever had. A year ago, when we became constructive on the industry, which was pretty much because we noticed OPEC got back in control because they got rid of the high cost production, we had to make the assumptions that supply was in peril and demand was growing. Today, the stocks are all up several 100%. But now we know supply is in peril. We know demand is the healthiest thing on this planet. And these stocks are actually trading cheaper than they were a year ago. So the investment side of it, I strongly recommend people to look at it and think about it as a logical way to offset one of their security risks, which is the cost of their energy is going higher, a lot higher. It won't take care of the other side of the security risk, and that's when the product doesn't arrive at your house. It's not going to make your shower warm. It's going to be cold no matter what when the power's not there. But it's going to make it a lot less cold when you know that you're making money in the industry that is enjoying the increased pricing. I'm going to say one thing about the Aboriginal side of things. First of all, I want to say that it's sad that there's actions of a few that are ruining the actions and efforts of many. I would say that the industry, the oil industry, has worked with Aboriginals for decades and have had incredibly successful relationships and recognized the hard work on the part of the Aboriginal community that do that. But what I would say today, a message that I would pass on to that group and Chris, to you, is you have to create financial accountability. That is the area where the market doubts at the Aboriginal group. And there's a lot of assets to literally give to and owed, frankly, to the community. And there's a lot of assets that need to be built with the community. But there needs to be financial accountability that I don't think there is yet today. And that's an important area where you will raise investor confidence if that's elevated.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. We're almost at the end of our time. So I just want to give you guys about 1 minute just to make a closing comment. We didn't get to Canadian policy as much as I had hoped. We just had such a rich conversation on every other issue. How should Canadian policy change? And, I think we can see how different Canadian policy is looking from American policy right now, and who is right and what accounts for that. We have the same kind of voters. We have the same kind of needs. And then, and they're in a crisis as soon as the gas tank prices go up. So what would you guys like to see Canadian policy change to respond to this climate, energy, and security crisis that we're seeing? Tim, I'll start with you. Oh, you're mute. There we go. And you're still somehow muted again. Now you're good. I see that you're good.
Okay. I'll just quickly, I think, with the huge opportunity, the huge resources, and the capacity to continuously improve the way we operate, I would hope that our federal government would start to enable us to be a global solution. We're going to increasingly use that language. And the point that you just raised is, in the US, the price of gasoline goes up and the president changes direction, from canceling Keystone to appealing to Vladimir Putin and OPEC to open the taps, to releasing the strategic reserve. Like, it is a problem, and he is addressing it with just a little change in the price of gasoline. In Canada, our federal leaders are driving a carbon tax to $170 a ton to drive up home heating costs and the price of fuel, and with the explicit intent of changing behavior. And I think that if that is the policy outcome, and they're being very forthwith about it, but just the difference in the incentives and what it's changing on policy, I can't reconcile why it is so different between our two nations.
Thanks so much, Tim. Rafi? And you're muted.
Sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, I mean, the thing, my wish list are just that. They're wishes. It's not going to happen. I'll tell you what is logical, but not with our government and how it's operating. Remember, we have a minority government that is dictating policies that would never be able to move with a majority government in the US. So they have control right now. They're taking advantage of it. But I would just say two very important things I would want to see immediately if in my wish list, which would never happen. One, we need to stop foreign funding. And in fact, we need a government that, instead of encouraging foreign funding of anti-energy policy, anti-oil activism in Canada, in fact, opposite, a government that stops that funding and applauds our industry's energy globally. And then the second thing I would say that is very important is to become, this is embarrassing that I have to say this, but Canada should become energy self-sufficient. It's ridiculous that we bring in oil and natural gas from other countries. It's absolutely mind-boggling to me, the lack of common sense around that. Obviously, that has to do with refineries and their funding and influence with governments and government agendas. So I would focus on foreign funding and becoming energy self-sufficient.
Super. Thanks so much, Rafi. And Chris, you have the final word. Real quick, in 1 minute, what would you do if you were Prime Minister for a day?
Well, including us into the policy. Look, at the end of the day, Rafi hit it on right on the button. Investors are already asking me, what are Indigenous communities prepared to put up for risk? What are they willing to put forward? And I believe our biggest asset is the land. Once that starts to change in terms of our ability to get access to our own land, you're going to see the door open right up. It's already happening. I know a lot of communities do have sole source revenues. In particular, we do. We have agreements with a port out there. We have access to some insurmountable of land. And now is our time to actually create this landing strip for industry to come to the table in a safe and effective manner. We want industry to be responsible. Well, we need to be responsible when we're at the table, when we invite you to the table to talk about energy opportunities. Combined with industry, the financial capabilities and traditional knowledge, we can make for an amazing project that fits and suits everybody in this country, and we can move forward and start getting our products to new market.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank all three of you for a tremendous discussion. Lots of fun. Would be nice to do it over beers one day, you know, when COVID is all over. And we're going to switch to the next panel now. So I think in Canada, and part of the reason behind having this panel, there are a lot of climate experts. There are a lot of people who spend a lot of time. We have good, you know, academic, journalistic, private, public sector knowledge about climate and that. And we have a phenomenal energy industry, you know, world in energy industry and experts on that side. But one area where I don't think we have the public discussion enough is on the security side. Thinking about energy from security crisis and what's coming up. So we're already seeing, you know, the OPEC is increasing its share. Russia has been increasing its share. And meanwhile, North American producers are not producing more, even as demand goes up, because the investment is there and there are some restrictive government policies. So to help us figure out what are the security implications of our current crises, I have today Jeff Kaczarski, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and an energy expert on Asia Pacific especially. Jane Nakano, a Senior Fellow with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Petra Dolata, an Associate Professor in the History Department at the University of Calgary. So welcome to you guys, and thanks for coming on. And I'm looking forward to, you know, increasing our public knowledge a little bit on the energy security crises kind of implications of what we've been seeing today. So to get us started, I'm going to do the same thing and give you all about 5 minutes just for your first reflections on what we've been seeing today. What are the implications? And what are the, you know, kind of what does this look like for national security coming up? Jeff, I'm going to start with you. Still muted.
Thanks, Heather. And I'm really pleased to be here today with everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about how energy impacts on global security and how this relates to what we're currently experiencing. Energy security traditionally concerns the relationship between national security and the availability of natural resources for energy consumption, in particular oil and gas. Various definitions of energy security exist, and As renewables have been growing and with increasing electrification, the concept of energy security is changing as the energy system evolves. Renewable electricity offers the advantage of being a domestically produced resource. So no one owns the wind and the sun, whereas oil, gas, and coal must be imported if a country has few domestic sources of these fuels. So in this sense, the power of major fossil fuel providers will eventually be diluted and perhaps even disappear. However, what many people forget is that the risks to energy security do not disappear. Instead, they shift toward the resources and resource providers whose inputs are essential to producing the wind turbines, solar cells, batteries, fuel cells, low carbon fuels, and other green technologies that we will increasingly rely on for reliable and affordable electricity. Energy security is shifting to focus on these areas, as well as the supply chains for critical minerals and rare earths that are vital inputs to these technologies. So in short, the energy transition will have many geopolitical implications and will reshape international energy relations. So what is global energy security? Traditionally, this has been about ensuring the free flow of crude oil and natural gas and avoiding market failures and other threats and disruptions that would result in supply or price shocks. Yet today, we're seeing and experiencing threats to global energy security. Rising natural gas prices have European governments warning their citizens of blackouts. Factories are being forced to shut down. Germany shut down their nuclear power plants and ramped up wind and solar, and now are forced to keep coal plants open and buy nuclear power from France. A strong post-COVID economic recovery has resulted in a sharp increase in demand, including for fossil fuels in China. Coal-fired power plants that had been shut down had to be started up again, even as China had cut off coal imports from Australia. Russia continues to threaten Ukraine over gas supplies. And ironically, we've all heard that even as President Biden attended COP26 in Glasgow, he was asking OPEC to increase production of oil. And yesterday, he announced the planned release of millions of barrels from the US Strategic Reserve in coordination with several other countries in order to help bring prices down. Now I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between energy, security, and climate. The latest energy shock is a reminder that energy security cannot be separated from the discussion about dealing with climate change. Environmental advocates act to cut off access to capital for oil and gas, thinking that somehow cutting off supply will have an impact on demand. Daniel Yergin, a well-known energy expert, says that the spike in fuel prices puts energy security and reliability back on the same agenda as the energy transition. He's very right about that. Like it or not, fossil fuels made up 83% of global primary energy consumption in 2020, so nations still rely on them to power their economies and sustain economic growth. The reality is the energy transition will proceed in different ways and at different speeds in different countries, depending on their unique circumstances. Developing countries such as India and even China have said they will continue to rely on fossil fuels to preserve energy affordability and bring more of their people out of poverty, even as they continue to expand renewable power. Of course, we need to continue strong efforts to reduce emissions and fossil fuel reliance while wrapping up clean energy technologies. But since wind and solar are intermittent, we still need stable baseload energy sources to stabilize the electricity grid and back up renewables. Since wind and solar only made up about 6% of global primary energy consumption in 2020, that means we will need nuclear power as well as oil and gas with abatement technologies for several more decades. I think that's good for now. Thank you.
All right. Not much there that I think anyone can disagree with, but Jane, we'll turn it to you for your thoughts and what we've been seeing and what has led to this and what are the challenges.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Heather. So I think, I wanted to talk a little more about the security of critical minerals supply chains, which sort of Jeff has touched upon. I think, the security of critical mineral supply chains is one of the best examples of how major developments or trends in the global energy system really raise security implications, or comes with security implications. And I think it's starting to become a very strategic concern to many Western policymakers for several, major reasons. One, I think that there is a strong growth for these clean energy technologies that require critical minerals and rare earth minerals. And we've seen the World Bank come out with its forecast. Also, IEA, like for example, the IEA says the mineral demand from EVs and batteries, electric vehicles and batteries, can grow 10 times under the stated policy scenario, and over 30 times in the sustainable development scenarios. I mean, I think there may be little difference in some figures depending on the scenarios, but the direction is very much the same. And two, I think this clean energy technologies is becoming one of the latest frontiers for geoeconomic competition between China and the West, and to some extent among some of the Western economies that do have interest in having clean energy manufacturing as well as strong climate commitment. I think, once upon a time, China was the world's factory, sort of a supplier of these minerals and metals, but it's no longer the case. China is starting to capture the more higher end value of this, clean energy supply chains or value chains. Today, China accounts for roughly 2/3 of the polysilicon manufacturing capacity in the world. China also has about 90% of wafer manufacturing capacity. When it comes to lithium ion batteries for electric vehicles, the majority of processing capacity for key components like cathodes, anodes, those things are under Chinese control, whether the factories are located in China or if it's Chinese financed capacities in other parts of the world. And accordingly, I think China's demand for the critical minerals that are key components for clean energy technologies is rising as well. So they're consuming much more of what they produce as opposed to sort of exporting. Thirdly, I think China has long been aware that China has natural resource wealth, including minerals. But I think it's starting to recognize there's a geopolitical value that comes with it. That's, I think one of the recent examples is when at one of the heights of the U.S.-China trade tensions, Xi Jinping, together with his chief, trade negotiator, Minister He, visited Jiangxi province, which is known for rare earth wealth. And it was, widely, seen as a signal from China or Beijing to Washington that China has commanding position on something that the U.S. is woefully dependent on China for. So all these things are coming together. I guess quickly, just let me wrap up by quickly just saying that I think it's something that our U.S. government recognizes. We've had very recently round of survey of how dependent we are on these minerals that are important for clean energy transition. So there are all these measures that are happening. I think that it's been very sort of a national security minded in the U.S. strategies to strengthen critical mineral supply chains. But I think with the Biden administration, there's another layer, which is the clean energy or climate as another driver for the U.S. to want to strengthen its critical mineral supply chains. And I'd love to talk more about it, but let me just stop there. I think I've used up my 5-minute allotted time, but very much look forward to telling you a little more about what exactly Biden administration is trying to do and with the support of Congress. But thank you.
Thanks, Jane, and we look forward to hearing that. And I think people are used to thinking when you think of energy crises of oil and gas, and it led to decades of war with the Middle East, and was based very much on petroleum. And we're seeing that crisis again. We're seeing Russia use its leverage in Europe with natural gas, and we're seeing Iran, I think, use that leverage also with its sanctions. But now you're talking about another front on the energy security crisis. As we come to rely on clean, low carbon energies, there is more reliance on minerals. And I think, you mentioned, I've heard this too, that we need 5 times the mining that we have today if we're going to transition. And not only for clean energy, but for our digital economy, for the knowledge sector, for everything we do, the way that our lives work now. So a second energy crisis front is definitely on the horizon. And Petra, you're a historian, so I'm anxious to hear your thought. How does what we are seeing now, and it seems like very fast, and a lot of things coming in the last few weeks and the last few months, how does that fit into how energy security has been played out in the last few decades?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. It is always fascinating as a historian who studies the emergence of the energy security narrative since the 1970s to see, whenever it pops up, because it's, it does in the 80s, it does kind of around 2008, and now here we are again. And, in between, we don't necessarily hear so much about it. So first of all, to say that I think it does make sense to realize that this is a concept that has emerged historically at a particular time in a particular locale, which was in the United States around the 1973 oil price crisis. And it's not surprising that, the United States is the kind of country that would very quickly combine national security with worries about oil price. And I say price because, I've already heard in the discussions here, security can be about availability, but as we see, mostly it has been about price. It's more about, what is the price that really breaks, citizens and no longer supporting a government. So it's one thing to, first of all, acknowledge that the idea of energy security has gone through so many iterations as it moves through the decades, if you will. And this is why in the 1990s, we add, of course, climate change to it. That, the idea is not only that energy should be available and it should be, at a reasonable price, but it should also be sustainably, at least to a certain extent. And then, in the 2000s, we start talking about energy justice. And all the big international organizations, whether it's the International Energy Agency, whether it's the European Union, whether it's even OPEC, they keep changing as well. If you look at their, definitions of what energy security is all about. So that's one of the things I think that we need to realize is that there are now so many dimensions to that security aspect, because of course we have also changed our understanding of security, whether it's only about the state, whether it's only about economy, or whether it's about us as individuals, having access to energy. So that's something that complicates, of course, our discussions today, because we have now so many layers of what energy security could entail. So that's one of the things that we see. The other problem is that even though in the 1970s, it was really about oil in the first place, it's called energy security. And I think that's one of the things that we need to be aware of, that often we equate energy with oil. But is that really the best way currently to do so still? Is that really, do we need to find a way to really get all the different aspects into an energy security? The last point that I would say is that it's not surprising that we have a very different discussion in terms of the international, because in the international, we do not have governments that can kind of go ahead and make certain decisions about how to define that security piece. And so instead, what we have a number of actors who interpret that security piece very differently. So we have, countries like Russia, countries like OPEC, very traditional understanding of security in the first place anyway. But secondly, they are producers. The energy security narrative in the beginning was formed by someone who was highly dependent on energy, because it stopped being that swing producer and a net producer of oil. So, that's where Canada comes in as well. That energy security piece wasn't originally about producers having safe markets, but that's another piece that's in there. So what I would say as the historian is that it does help to understand the way that so many layers have been added to what today we call energy security, plus to understand where some of these countries are coming from historically and the way that they have grappled and decided what energy security means. Because this is, as a German, I always have to explain, in Germany, there are people who are willing to pay a price for higher energy prices. That's a cultural, social thing that comes out of a very particular history of engaging with energy. So that's kind of where I feel the historian can bring some, nuances to that discussion on the security. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about some of this.
Well, even as a political scientist, of course, we know that historians can bring something to this. But maybe let's focus on the international relations here a little bit. And Jeff, I'll turn to you. Petra, you mentioned, some of our approach in the West, a lot of our approach in the West is certainly based on some culture and some values, that we would pay a higher price. We have the luxury of being able to pay a higher price. But I think we're going to get a lesson in realism right away, that there are a lot of countries that don't share the same values and aren't motivated in the same way in energy security. And you mentioned that, the members of OPEC, Russia, probably China, would be on that list. And so, Jeff, what will happen if North American, Western Europe production declines and OPEC and Russia get a bigger share of the world's supply? What are the security implications of that? And is it a good idea? Can we manage that?
Yeah, okay, good. Am I still? I'm not muted. Good. Well, the first thing to say, I think, is that obviously energy is subject to politicization and manipulation. And it's important to remember that state-owned national oil and gas companies, NOCs we call them for short, control the majority of global oil and gas production, not private companies. And I think right now NOCs control about 65% of global oil reserves and about 60% of global production. So at the same time, those NOCs are under the influence of countries, governments that own them. Some of those, in fact, many of them are authoritarian regimes, many with weak environmental, social, and governance practices, including countries like Russia, Iran, Venezuela. Most OPEC countries in the Middle East are, that region is known for its instability. There's divergences on human rights, democracy, support for extremism. Some of these countries have weaponized their supply capabilities by threatening to slow or stop crucial supplies, manipulate prices, or exert political leverage over import-dependent countries. So Russia's a good case in point. President Putin is seeking to destabilize Ukraine as we speak, in part by completing the Nord Stream pipeline that will bypass Ukraine, while also threatening to withhold exports to Western Europe as sanctions on Russia are increased. So I think the implications for energy security mean that oil and gas will continue for the foreseeable future to be, make up a very influential part of energy security, even as we proceed through the energy transition. And I think that hydrocarbon production is likely to become increasingly concentrated in only a few countries, many of which are the ones I just mentioned, authoritarian regimes that control national oil companies. That's of great concern. It's got to be a great concern, not only to us here in the West, but also to countries who are highly import dependent for resources, particularly oil, gas, and coal, like China, Japan, South Korea, and others. And they feel the effects of shortages and price shocks even more acutely than we do. And I think that's why it's so important for Canada as one of the largest free market sources of global energy resources that is not controlled by state-owned enterprises. And we do have high environmental, social, and governance practices. It's important for us to contribute to global energy security by providing supplies to our allies and partners that they're going to need even over the course of this transition. I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jane, because we do want to know more about what our southern neighbors are thinking on this. And we alluded to it in the last session. the policy divergence that we're seeing in Canada and the United States is quite interesting. Where in Canada, I think we're still on kind of the just transition kind of a policy train. And the United States, I think we saw, very strong democratic desire and appetite for climate policies. But now confronted with, the realism. And I guess as a global superpower, don't have the luxury of just sticking to a just transition kind of a thing. And the Biden administration is now acting on trying to manage energy security supplies, security affordability, or energy affordability. So what is the thinking? What are you seeing in the Biden administration? Has there been a shift? Do you see this shift continuing, or what can we expect?
Yeah, so I actually think that a just transition continues to be key to what the Biden administration can achieve in a sustained manner. The reason why I say it is that, we've seen with this, the shift away from oil gas, and that is not to say, oil gas resource should be eliminated. I actually do think that it does have energy security value, but the degree to which that it has disrupted, it has brought on a lot of, socioeconomic displacement, has become really a challenge for U.S. climate commitment to be sustainable. And so without addressing, just transition, group of issues, how to address, some of the mining community concerns, what is the potential of, having stronger upstream in critical minerals, how that may or may not help address, coal mining or declining demand for, coal. Past year or two, we just haven't seen any new coal investment, for example, in the United States, so coal-fired power plant investment. So that actually becomes the just transition becomes even more important politically if the climate commitment is to remain sustainable across, to survive sort of a changes of changing government or the, particularly, political party changes every 4 years, every 8 years. But I think, in one of the specific tools or the approaches that Biden administration is really emphasizing is to facilitate the clean energy manufacturing. So it's not just enough to give a clear demand signal in order to advance climate, objective or goal, climate change, mitigation goal, but really to address some of the import dependence concern that may come with just simply, purchasing clean energy components from abroad. I think, there is some, a lot of investment that is being made into clean energy manufacturing. But then also when it comes to oil and gas, there's a lot of review, but, for example, looking at the methane emissions is something that we've long expected, out of the EPA, and it finally came out. And so I think the idea is to really, do it at the same time. Perhaps sometimes the sequencing becomes a little bit of a challenge. I think, the previous panel also sort of talked about how, Biden administration needing to talk to the OPEC plus, while trying to still facilitate the deployment of renewables and EVs. But I think sequencing is always a challenge. I don't think it's necessarily unique here to the Biden administration in this particular sequence, particular context. But we've seen Congress pass and the president signing into law the infrastructure package that really provides a lot of money to clean energy manufacturing, but then also recycling. To some extent, I think some of the languages that we're starting to use sound a lot more like how the Western Europeans have been talking about I guess more of a integrated approach to clean energy that is like the circular economy. So, let me stop there. But I think, there's a lot that this administration is starting to do. Of course, there is a bit of a tension between how, some of the folks that want to see faster deployment of clean energy are not a big fan of extractive industry activities, so that there's still, that tension that still needs to be resolved. And I think that's where I think the U.S. has a lot of opportunity to cooperate with countries such as Canada and perhaps Australia to really explore, the type of approach that we can take as, countries with high standards in mining, or even, ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards, and try to meet the demand that would be, arising from continued clean energy deployment.
Thanks so much, Jane. So Petra, we'll turn it to you, because I don't think we've ever seen, I know you're an expert, or you've considered energy transitions, but I don't think we'll ever have an energy transition like this one again. This is the big kahuna of energy transitions, and it's probably going to be messy. Petroleum is a uniquely energy dense product, and we don't have, maybe other than nuclear, very good replacements for it. So what are you expecting? What do you think, what do you know that you can tell us about how the next few decades are going to roll out of having this energy transition, and how bad is it going to be?
Well, first of all, as you know, never ask a historian about the future, because that's where we normally kind of back off. However, I think that's exactly the word that we would be using. When you study energy transitions historically, it's always messy. And it's certainly not the way that you expected it to develop. So unintended consequences is a huge piece of energy transitions. We had massive energy transitions as civilizations. The industrialization in itself is a massive energy transition, where we move from these kind of, a low density organic energy carriers to what we call mineral energy carriers, a lot more dense. But also, of course, we look at very different uses of these energies. When we look at oil and gas, it is really about transportation. It's a lot about it being a feedstock for other things that don't necessarily have to do with providing motion, right? Or providing work, which is normally the energy piece. So this is why it's really interesting that, there's almost the electricity piece is separate, because it's such a different kind of thing, and you have a lot more opportunities to diversify into alternatives. And we are stuck, really with the motion piece, which it's difficult to see how quickly oil can be replaced there. So first of all, definitely will be a messy affair, and it will not play out the way that any government will plan this to play out. And I'm saying this because actually most of the historical energy transitions were not willed by governments. We're not pushed, right, as a big visionary project to happen. It may have been particular circumstances, which have to do with technology, innovation, and then policy that supports it. But the way that we currently look at energy transition, that we must change, is only something that maybe was discussed in the 1970s, when we actually first talked about energy transition as the piece there. So what this means is that, unfortunately, we cannot really rely on being able to socially engineer that transition. So energy systems are always social and cultural systems. So if we say we need to transition to a new energy system, it is not enough to introduce technologies, policies, financial incentives. You need to realize that you need to also change the social and cultural system. This is the demand side, right? This is the behavior. This is what some people like to call social innovation. But the problem is, people are not always the most rational actors. People have all sorts of reasons to not believe, certain things. And so this is the problem that we encounter, that we cannot necessarily just shift an energy system and bring everyone along. And particularly not in democratic societies, where, this is part of the citizens being involved in this, having a say. And so this is where it gets even messier, that even if governments have a certain vision that they want to put forward, the unintended consequences are possibly much, much bigger than anything that we can anticipate. Equally, you need to find a way to bring citizens in much earlier in terms of your technology development. We see that there is technology, if we think a lot of the net zero technology, right, that there's quite some resistance of segments of populations, which can derail sometimes the deployment of these technologies, even though, you know, as an expert, you might say, this is the solution. But in a democratic society, this becomes a massive problem. So I guess one of the things that you can deal with trying to bring about that certain energy transition is to find ways to completely upend the way that we develop, innovate, and deploy technology, bringing in society much earlier along the way. Secondly, we need to find a way, and I know, you know, this is a huge philosophical debate. We need to find a way to get away from these sort of bipolar ways of talking about this. We all know, and that's what, you know, the climate change panel tells us, it's actually not one solution, not two solutions, it's all of the above. It needs to be a whole suite of solutions. And so rather than talking about we want oil or we don't want oil, or we want this or we don't want this, we need to find a way to talk about we need all of this, we need all of you to be on board, but also we need to find ways that we understand the short and the long term. As a historian, I don't have a problem to see that in the long term, oil and gas will play a different role. As a short term, a politician who has a 5-year election cycle will not have, you know, the luxury of thinking about those long-term things. So that's where we need to start reconsidering the whole process of how to discuss this very long-term transitions that I think, and most of us will agree, in the long term are going to come. And we rather need to talk about how to manage that in terms of those left behind. How do you deal with, you know, deindustrialization? Other countries have done that. So that's where the historian would also like to talk more about the history of deindustrialization in countries like West Germany, where governments stepped in, retraining of a workforce, all these kind of things.
Well, I'm glad you brought up retraining of the workforce, Petra, because that's a bone I have to pick when people talk about the just transition of moving roughnecks to installing solar panels. That's the transition we're talking about. That's where the pain points are going to be. And to me, it's preposterous. We're talking about billions of people not having enough energy, and then therefore not having enough food and not having enough shelter. And that's the just transition we're facing. And it's going to be painful. I don't think people are prepared for how painful the energy transition is going to be. And maybe you guys agree or disagree. But in my opinion, the Canadian foreign policy, and we are an energy superpower. You know, we have the 3rd largest reserves. I think the 4th biggest producer of natural gas. But we don't think of ourselves as an energy superpower. We don't conceive of what role we play in maintaining energy security and energy affordability. And there's no discussion on it. And there's not a lot of sophistication, in my opinion, in Ottawa on it. Are there countries that you think are prepared for this energy transition and the security implications? Are you seeing any policies or thinking where you say those people understand what's coming, those people are prepared? Or do you think we're all a little bit floundering? We have not confronted with this issue the way that we need to yet? And I'll just throw it out there, whoever wants to start.
Maybe I'll start. I think countries, like I said earlier, you know, countries are taking different approaches based on the unique circumstances and situations, you know. And I'll bring up one. Japan is one I'm mostly familiar with, and you know, this is a country that's highly dependent on imports of fossil fuels. You know, over 85% dependent, and so that means oil, natural gas, coal. And they have had an institutionalized strategic planning system around energy for many years, and they update it on a regular basis, and it's extremely detailed. It runs into dozens and dozens of pages. They never really achieve the targets that they set, which is kind of ironic, but you know, they believe in government planning, and they think it's important to send signals to the private sector and related organizations to sort of help them make decisions to move the country in a particular direction. And the one thing I would say Japan has been very successful on is taking that all of the above approach. They haven't got on the bandwagon of, cutting off investments in oil and gas. They have, they have set targets that still, they've reduced their target for the, amount of oil and gas and coal in supplying primary energy in their economy. And they've recently just ramped up renewables quite a bit more, but they haven't abandoned fossil fuels, and they're still hanging on to nuclear power as a particular goal, and they want to increase it, even though they were a country that experienced, a disaster back in 2011. So they're taking that all of the above approach. I think that's wise in their case. They originally had technology in solar panels, and China basically took that over and was able to produce on a larger scale and cheaper prices. But Japan is moving in some interesting directions. They're looking now at ammonia, and ammonia is a huge opportunity for Canada in the future too, because ammonia is a carrier of hydrogen. It's something we know how to make here in Canada. Alberta's just signed a big agreement with JOGMEC, and there's a plan to invest in an ammonia facility in Alberta, and that ammonia is going to be used to help reduce coal emissions by burning it in coal plants, but also potentially to produce hydrogen out of it. So there are alternatives moving forward. Japan does a lot of R&D in these kinds of things, and I think that's one example of a very forward kind of policy. So I would throw them out as one example, I think.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And I learned this recently. It was a Japanese person that invented LNG, and was a big solution to a big problem that Japan had in terms of importing energy. So, Jane, what are your thoughts on this? Is anyone ahead of the curve on this issue?
Great question. By the way, I do agree with you. I think this energy transition will be extremely painful. And, as far as the country, I actually happen to agree with Jeff that Japan has done quite a bit. But I guess when it comes to the type of upstream sort of worker issues that, we face in the United States, and perhaps, Canadian neighbors face, and some of the countries that have continued more about extractive industry, has a very prominent extractive industry footprint on the national economy to date. Countries like Japan, do not have to deal with it as much, just because they just have very poor natural resources generally, and I think they closed the last commercial coal mining back in 2000. But I think I can't think of any single country. I think every country has something that it sort of lacks. But I just wanted to also touch upon the role of this industrial strategy. There's so much interest in this notion of industrial strategy around the world, and looking at different pieces, whether it's the hydrogen strategy, whether it's the EV, high capacity battery strategy. I think there's desire for policymakers to want to be not to be left behind, if you will. It's it'd be great if they could be ahead of other countries, but also like not to be left behind, and sort of be have a good way to mobilize national resources. In the case of the U.S., it's the federal level. That could be harder than perhaps some other countries that do not have federal system, and much smaller than we are, perhaps like Scandinavian countries, for example. But it's just been interesting to see that and particularly in the United States, there's this really traditionally there's general apprehension or sort of a, almost allergic reaction to the word industrial strategy, because we do want the market play a strong role, and I'm not opposed to it. But I think having watched countries such as China be able to perhaps seize on this, the bigger sort of economic benefits out of this energy transition by investing quite heavily and being able to start making penetrate economies around the world, I think there is like relook as what's the best way for us, the OECD non-state-led economies, to be able to better align the government resources together with what the private sectors can do, and then as well as some of the externalities that we need to address, such as addressing emissions. So, but yeah, let me stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jane. And Petra, I'll turn it over to you. And I know you're familiar with the European context. Are there bright lights there? Is the EU ahead of this curve, or are they living in an alternate universe? And if you can touch on the Russia, German, EU dynamics in your answer, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, small question there. So first of all, I would say, when you say Canada is a superpower, I recognize, yes, we have all these resources, but as you also know, we have problem getting it to market when it's not the US. And so, it's not that easy, and it won't be that quick that we can even be the bearer of better energy security to, either Western Europe or Japan, because, if we can't get it to market. And I'm reminded, even in the 1980s, since you mentioned LNG, and that's a Japanese thing. Those discussions first was Dome Petroleum, and then it was Gulf. Came to nothing, and all it had to do with the plummeting of prices again, in 1986, and the more attractive U.S. market. And so this is where I come back again to the long-term, short-term. A lot of these things really rely on medium to long-term decisions in terms of opening markets. But it's often actually the business piece that brings it down the minute the prices go in a different way. And so this is where what I see when I compare Europe and North America is that in the European context, you might not call it industrial policy, but it's a lot easier to actually implement something that we would consider industrial policy that really allows you to sort of, steer. I wouldn't say direct, that sounds so French, right? But it kind of steers some of those decisions. Now, in the North American context, I really see that it is a lot more looking towards business and entrepreneurial leadership in this. And this is where I sometimes wonder, is it always the best way to just, hope that these are the kind of actors and players who will do this. But I'm equally aware of the fact that it's not that easy to use a model that might work elsewhere because there's a much bigger acceptance of this kind of industrial policy and then move it here. So I think this is where, even if we were to find a model elsewhere, particularly in Europe, I would be very, very skeptic that would be possible to work here. And so it creates more problems for Canada. For example, hydrogen. If you look at the EU hydrogen strategy, if you look at the German hydrogen strategy, and then compare it to the Canadian hydrogen strategy, which has a lot in it in terms of not green hydrogen, but of course, blue hydrogen, right? The idea that natural gas and then in combination with CCS, that this is kind of the hydrogen that Canada could really push for. Well, guess what? The European Union is not interested necessarily in blue hydrogen. It has its own members, like, the Netherlands, who are really looking towards that because they need to switch their natural gas industry to something else. So they are much more interested in green hydrogen. So even though we see that these countries are working on the same piece, I find it really difficult to see how even Canada and the European Union could come together on the hydrogen piece, Because it might be that the European Union says, Canada, we are only interested in your green hydrogen that maybe comes out of Quebec, but we are not interested in your blue hydrogen. And so I think that's where it will be difficult and painful, not just in terms of the domestic piece, but also the international piece for Canada to navigate that. Because actors like Japan and the European Union do not mean the same thing when they talk about hydrogen. That's why in the Canadian case, and I think that was useful, there was very quickly a move away from green to clean hydrogen, right? And the whole discussion about sort of a life cycle assessment of these pieces. But this will really be very, very difficult, I think, for Canada, if it wants to deal with, you know, some of these partners in the West, including Japan or Canada. And the last piece I should say, though, I agree with you, Heather. And coming from the area in Germany where they retrained miners to be something else, it didn't always work as well as it was, you know, portrayed. However, we equally see that actually a lot of the energy industry is still making profit with fewer and fewer people. So I think what we will see anyway is that the employment in those industries will go down. And I'm much more interested in a piece where government tries to think about what are, you know, jobs of the future, whichever they are. So it's a very long answer, but I hope, you know, it's, if there were that wonderful model out there, we could all adapt. I don't think we need to spend all this time talking about it.
I would love to end on an optimistic note, but I just can't because there are too many things happening, and we haven't even touched on climate security. And this is another thing that states and governments have to prepare for. And Canada, I mean, we're experiencing it's a weekly occurrence, you know, especially in BC. So this is a very serious issue that states and governments need to confront. But I'm wondering, and Jeff, I know you want, I'll let you go first. You can comment on Petra's too, because I know you want to follow up on that. But do you guys have any hope or optimism that governments will choose addressing long-term climate security implications over the short-term energy crisis we're about to have? What are, you know, is it possible to, you know, do two things at once? Or is the energy crisis, you know, just going to take over everything? Because that's how, you know, voters think in the short term and governments think in the short term. What are the chances of, are we just going to have both? Or can we just maybe not have an energy crisis and just deal with the long-term impacts of the climate security crisis in the long term? Jeff, I'll start with you. And if you want to have a quick follow-up on Petra's comments too, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think to answer your last question first, I'd say we are making progress. I mean, at COP26, for whatever you may think of what came out of that, there were some significant agreements on methane reductions, on, phase out of coal, even though it didn't go as far as some would like. So I think, I mean, progress is being made. Countries have ramped up their NDCs and now are promising to reduce emissions more than they had before. So, I mean, I think that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think, you know, we're making progress. It's never going to be as much progress as some advocates and would like. But there's the reality of dealing with this very large and complex socio-technical system called the energy system, which, as somebody mentioned earlier, it's not just a technical challenge, it's a social challenge at the same time. And we all know that making changes in society take decades. And this one is going to take decades too. But the comment I wanted to make about Petra's, and some really good comments there, I'm pretty optimistic for Canada. I would agree, Canada is definitely not an energy superpower. I mean, we have the potential to be a superpower, but we've never exercised it because we haven't had access to global markets. Once we have access to global markets, that is a possibility if the government and if our exporters are able to follow through on plans. But we do have things progressing. I mean, TMX is moving forward. Looks like it's going to get completed by next year. LNG Canada is on track. They're over 50% built out now. So we've got major LNG and crude oil export capacity coming on stream within the next, say, couple of years. So Asia Pacific, as I said before, it's going to be at least half of world demand for energy going forward out to 2050. That's the market for us. It's not really going to be Europe, to be quite honest with you. It's a very complex, it's far away. It's a difficult political situation there. Energy is so politicized. I think we're much better to focus on Asia Pacific. And I think that's where our future is going to be. Anyway, that's all I have.
Thanks, Jeff. Jane, is there any cause for optimism that states can manage the climate crisis, climate security, and energy security at the same time?
I think I guess as an optimist, I have to say yes. And it's not like we have a choice not to. I mean, I think we really need to address both climate security, but then also energy crisis. But I think it's fundamentally, the energy crisis, but that's, fundamentally it's about, I think, energy access. But for that reason, I am, there's quite a bit of a difference in pace, between Europe and North America, and then also, even, between North America and Asia Pacific about, things like, coal, phase out or phase down. And it's a very sensitive issue. Yeah, I think it sort of goes back to the equity issue a little bit about, climate justice. So, I think a lot of governments had a very honest conversation in Glasgow. And it's, no one ever says it's going to be easy, but there is a definitely sense of urgency. For that matter, I'm a big fan of having all of the above approach. I mean, when it comes to coal, unabated coal, I think is really definitely a problem. But, there is, for the immediate future for countries in, developing countries that are highly dependent on coal, I think, cleaner coal is, something that's viable in the toolbox. But then I think we also have to have a lot of more honest conversation with the public that this, I guess this energy transition, sort of going back to the minerals discussion, but it's going to be highly mineral intensive. What are we going to do about, our desire to deploy, but then also still, mitigate the level of import dependence that could become a security challenge. So we still have to have a lot of conversation. And by the way, I don't think dependence on China, for example, I did sort of touch upon it earlier, but that shouldn't be a reason for us to stop investing in clean energy or trying to deploy more of it. I think both oil and gas, but then also, renewables and EV energy storage have different types of benefits to energy security and energy access.
Thanks. Yeah, Canada might have missed the boat on being an energy superpower in the age of oil and gas, but maybe we'll get back on that boat when it's in a green economy and be an energy superpower in the critical minerals chain. Petra, I'm going to give you the last word.
So I just wanted to say that I'm probably both optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. I do think, we have to do something, and I'm sure that we'll see more of that. That you have to try, at least you have to try. I would say energy literacy would be a much more important piece here, often not discussed. I know it's in the Canadian hydrogen strategy where they talk about, educating the next generation of entrepreneurs and scientists. And I agree with that. We need to do a lot more in terms of educating the public, educating, the next generations in terms of energy literacy, which includes also knowledge about history, I feel. I'm a bit pessimistic because the problem is it is so, as you've seen, right? It is so nuanced and complex. Unfortunately, news cycles do not like nuanced and complex. And that's part of the problem, right? Politicians, many people promising all the quick fixes when we all know there is no quick fix. And this is where I'm very pessimistic because I do not know how to change that. I mean, it's such a human thing to crave the simple, right? And so it's such a tough one. The third piece is, we need to plan, though, for a future, not just banking on whatever might be our strength now. I think you need to at least try and think about what is it that we need in terms of giving to our workforce so that they can pivot and adapt. Because we may not know what the future is, but we may try find ways that people are at least a lot better positioned to deal with whatever comes their way. And so that's kind of where I would stop.
Well, Petra, I know that you're off to teach about this important topic right now to some students and promote some energy literacy. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists, thank our audience for this great conversation, chipping away a little bit, I think, at promoting some public discussion on this important matter. And I know that we'll be talking about it, we won't be able to not talk about it in the decade to come. So thanks all for watching. Thanks to Macdonald-Laurier Institute for hosting this, and everyone have a great day. Thanks.